everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. And this video is Red, White, and Royal Blue, a historian's analysis. Part 4, I do not need a lecture from you about idealism, the political ideology of Red, White, and Royal Blue. So, as I think I've said before in these videos, Red, White, and Royal Blue is my favorite movie, and I believe that it should be taken very seriously and can be analyzed and explored as a very complex, rich film. Then that's despite, as you'll see, the serious criticisms that I would also make of the movie. So as I've tried to show, the characters are real and complex, and at the same time one can explore the layers of symbolism and allusion woven throughout the film. It's, I think, denser and richer than any other movie I've seen in that way. But I want to talk now about another important aspect of the movie, which is the politics, or more precisely, the political ideology. And this mostly comes into focus in the electoral plotline, which revolves around President Ellen Claremont seeking a second term in office in the White House against a Republican challenger, Governor Jeffrey Richards. And more specifically, this whole theme hinges on the private struggle between Ellen and her son Alex over the best strategy to follow in her quest for re-election. Ultimately, as you know if you've watched the film, Alex gets his way in that the campaign pursues a Texas strategy. And in the end, we get a happy, affirming ending with Ellen winning. And just in brief, I would observe from my perspective that we never learn exactly what Ellen's victory means. What exactly is at stake in this electoral battle? What are the differing positions of the two candidates? What different interests do they represent? And what are their coalitions of support? The movie, ironically, neglects to tell us what the so-called real impact on people's lives is that the Claremont administration is trying to make. And in terms of the stakes of this election, we don't know what most of the issues under dispute are, and we know barely anything at all about the opponent, Jeffrey Richards. Basically, you could say we're given to understand that Ellen is good and her opponent is bad, and Alex wants to help her re-election, and he wants to do so in a so-called idealistic way. And as we saw, his plan in the end succeeds, so hence her victory, Ellen's victory, is by extension also Alex and Henry's victory. Hence the double meaning that I've pointed out of those last lines, we won, right? We won the election and we won acceptance of our relationship. So one could say that the stakes and tension in the political storyline are basically borrowed from those of the personal storyline, right? We in the audience want Ellen to win, because we want Alex and Henry to be happy and be accepted. Now, I would say, and I'll try to flesh this out more later in the video, but I would say that the relative superficiality of the political plotline contrasts with the characterization of the main characters, Alex and Henry, with their very subtle personalities, relationships, inner lives, which I've discussed in previous videos. Right? This dimension of the film is often subtle, sensitive, realistic. It's elaborated with many metaphors and visual symbols. And all in all, it gives a rich and textured sense of the characters' behavior and motivations. And whereas in the romance we get a sense of tension and of paradox, by comparison, in the political scenes, we get rather vague messages and slogans like building a grassroots movement that avoid paradox or tension. So in my personal view, the politics are the film's biggest weakness. Now, one might ask, if this is a weaker aspect of the movie, then why discuss the political ideology at all? If it is simplistic and superficial, as I'm trying to claim, then why not just politely leave the whole subject alone? Why not just say, this is a fun rom-com. What did you expect? That the politics would be like the Battle of Algiers? And all of this critical analysis can seem rather petty, right? All my analysis in these videos can be seen as going overboard, right? But in this particular case, you could ask, if so many people enjoy the book and the film as an escapist fantasy, imagining an alternate America without Trump, then why not just let people have their fun? And to that, I would say I definitely do want people to have fun with this movie. But I believe that we will have more fun by analyzing it in a serious way for what it can reveal or illuminate about sex, love, politics, art. That's sort of the point of this whole series. And as I've said before, I do not want to apologize for this movie or condescend to it. I believe that it aspires to be a lot more than just a fun rom-com, and the places where it succeeds at that are no more or less significant than the places where it falls short. And even more than that, I would say the contrast between the two is itself very interesting and revealing. And it raises the question, why would a film that is so pithy and so adept at conveying subtleties of character, motive, personality be simplistic, vague, and even facile in its political storyline? So this, I think, may be revealing about the film and about the context and the moment in history in which it was made. So, first of all, just to get a couple of things out of the way, one could argue that the superficiality or thinness of the politics in this movie is because of time constraints, right? The filmmakers couldn't give us a rich or nuanced political storyline because they had to fit everything from this very long and rich novel into just 2 hours on film. But that explanation, in my view, is not enough for several reasons. One is that the writers do show great economy in conveying subtleties of characters' fears, desires, motives, and implicit beliefs through brief remarks or gestures. And why would they not do the same thing for the political aspect? Or why would they even do the opposite? And I'm going to suggest, and some viewers may disagree, but I'm going to suggest that this is not simply an accident, but rather that this film reflects a mindset or an ideology that views politics as fundamentally a contest over taste and persona, rather than an arena of contending interests or policy programs. So in short, you could say it's an ideology that reduces politics to personality, and that this mentality itself tends to protect vested interests and the status quo. Now, these things I'm saying here may be contentious, but regardless, either way, whether one wants to defend the film or offer a different explanation, either way, the political dimension of this film cannot be ignored, since it is clearly an inherent and important aspect of the movie, and it cannot be separated from the romance. It's firstly fundamental to the character and personality of Alex. His political ambitions and drive show his idealism, his altruism, all of which attract Henry. And as for Henry, as I've said before, Henry's very existence is political, in that he is a prince and hence a national symbol. And this is encapsulated in Henry's line in the confrontation scene in his bedroom, where he tells Alex, "I wish you could see me for who I am and not who you want me to be," thus implying that politics and being a public figure is inseparable from his very being. Secondly, the politics adds a critical further dimension to the plot, a sort of third element, as many writing teachers will tell you you ought to have in your stories. It's not just person against person. There should be some sort of third element in the background. And in the movie, we see these implicit parallels between the two missions, the personal and the political. Between Alex, you could say, winning Henry and winning Texas. And again, then the double meaning of "we won" at the end. And all of this makes the film, even if I think the political aspect is thin or superficial, still its presence makes the movie more rich, more multi-layered. It raises the tension and the possible ramifications of Alex and Henry's affair. For instance, this long-running theme that's always there in the background of the inescapable politicization of the characters' lives and the impossibility of privacy. And lastly, politics, you could say, must be fundamental to the story because we know that this was the genesis of the story in the first place. So the movie, of course, was based on the book, the novel by Casey McQuiston. And Casey has said that they began writing this novel in the 2010s. And Casey has said in articles and interviews that they first conceived of the idea of a story involving a child of the US president and a foreign prince. And they thought of it initially largely as a satire of politics. They then created the character of Ellen Claremont, inspired mainly by Wendy Davis, the Texas state legislator who came to national attention in 2013 when she undertook an 11-hour-long filibuster on the State House floor to try to protect access to abortion in Texas. And specifically, Casey McQuiston said to Publishers Weekly in 2019, after the book came out, they said, quote, "I watched the Wendy Davis filibuster and I was crying. I was so moved by what she did. That inspired the character of President Ellen Claremont," end quote. So you can see here, although Ellen Claremont, the president, might not have been the first character to be invented, she was the first point where the author made a sort of emotional connection and investment in this story. Now, we can see from these comments and recollections that the story of Red, White, and Royal Blue was not initially intended as a response to Trump. But reportedly, the tone and direction of the novel did change after Trump won the election in 2016. And Casey has said, quote, "I didn't intend it to be a response to Trump. I expected the election to go a different way. Suddenly, it had to serve a bigger purpose. I wanted an antidote to all the negativity and what feels terrible about politics in this country. I wanted to hearken back to the sense of hope that I had when I was a junior in high school when Obama got elected," end quote. So we can see here, as a result of Trump's rise to power, the novel became, you could say, more serious, less of a satire, and it was laced with this sort of nostalgia for previous events earlier in the 21st century, before the rise of Trump. And also, Casey has said that details of the story changed. For example, Alex's Secret Service bodyguard, Amy, became transgender. So the book, as we've discussed before, was published in 2019, had some initial success, but then really took off in 2020, largely as an escapist fantasy, imagining an alternate political timeline without Trump. So hence, while Trump was not the initial impetus for the conception of Red, White, and Royal Blue, and he does not directly appear in the movie, nonetheless, he looms in the background of the story and of how it was shaped and adapted. And the figure of Governor Richards talking about industrial job losses can be seen as a sort of milder stand-in for Trump or for Trumpism. So on the one hand, one could say, considering the particular needs that this movie serves for the audience, it can seem rather petty or mean-spirited to critique it in this way. So many people have been very disturbed by the turn in politics over the last 10 years, the infringements of civil rights and liberties, the demonization of immigrants and queer people, especially trans people, the decimation of public agencies, and recently the abuse of the National Guard. So you could say, if a movie like Red, White, and Royal Blue represents a rejection of that program, then why quibble over its supposed flaws? Isn't this aiming at the wrong target? And I would say that in the past year, anger and consternation has also risen, not just about Trump, but also about the lack of an effective response to Trump, the failure of parties, politicians, or organizations to come up with an effective counter strategy, or even in some cases to even try to put forward a counter strategy. So therefore, it is an important and I think unavoidable discussion. We have to consider what might constitute a real or effective opposition, or you could say antidote to Trumpism. And in this way, Red, White, and Royal Blue can be very relevant and revealing. I would suggest that this movie shows the wishes and desires of those who oppose Trump and what he stands for, and also the unexamined assumptions that shape and delimit those desires. So in sum, I think it serves as a window into an ideology, more or less the ideology of the middle-class base of the Democratic Party, which strongly rejects Trump and hence is part of the majority of the population that opposes Trump, but still that has not been able to mobilize a coalition to stop him, and apparently does not even think in those terms. So if one opposes Trump and his actions, then it is not only valid, but crucial to look at the ideology of a film like Red, White, and Royal Blue and its assumptions and limitations as part of a broader reflection on how to win a struggle against a figure like Trump. So what I want to get at is not the political message. So this is pretty simple. It's summed up more or less in Alex's speech, which is at the same time his personal coming out, and which involves, the right to privacy, personal freedom, self-determination. I'm not going to analyze that explicit message, but what I want to get at is this ideology, this set of assumptions that frame the story, assumptions about the world that are often implicit and unconscious. So an ideology can be defined, and I think I remember a professor in a film class explaining, in his view, ideology is basically the set of categories that storytellers use that divide up and order the world, and that the story then uses and reinforces. You can think of it kind of like the rules of a game, what pieces go where on the board. And moreover, they're rules that everyone already knows, and so that don't need to be explained. And it has implications for how we see and understand real-life political events and our roles in them. What sort of things should we demand from our political system and from our leaders, and what is unthinkable or off-limits? So I want to understand this by looking at what we do see and hear in the film and what we do not. The politics of a piece of art often comes through in what is left out. So let's talk about what's actually there in the film, starting with the basic plot that I've already alluded to, and the political mission. So the main overall goal of the main characters is to defeat Jeffrey Richards and get Ellen Claremont reelected. Now, what are the stakes here? Well, we know that both of these candidates are concerned with jobs and with deindustrialization.
We're now losing 2 manufacturing jobs every single minute of every day.
We don't know what Richards' proposed strategy is to regain jobs or reindustrialize. As for Ellen Claremont, it seems that her strategy is through a trade deal, which may imply that, for one thing, Claremont has more of a substantive plan, whereas Jeffries apparently is more superficial, relying on just slogans and catchphrases, as captured in the scene in The Office where some political operatives are watching Jeffrey Richards on TV and they're doing a drinking game and, taking drinks when he says sort of cliche words like prosperity.
And that's why I can deliver on my plan and bring prosperity.
Now, all of the characters that we see on screen agree in supporting Claremont. We never hear from the other side why other people might prefer Richards, but instead the debate and disagreement that we see in the film are internal to the Claremont camp and their debates over strategy. So what are these competing strategies? I'll call them A and B. Well, strategy A relies on winning the Midwest. And this is alluded to very early on in the opening scenes in the Oval Office in the White House when the president is sort of scolding Alex for the international incident that he's caused and how it might disrupt her efforts at concluding a trade deal with Great Britain.
I'm on the ballot again in 14 months, and I need the farming exports and manufacturing jobs that this deal provides to take to Midwest voters.
So the sort of main sub-goal of this strategy is secure a trade deal with Britain, and then a further sub-goal, you could say, is to woo the British public and Prime Minister in order to secure a good deal. And then as part of that strategy, the sort of sub-goal is that they need to make Alex and Henry appear to be friends. And hence you have this symbolic link between the affair of Alex and Henry and the foreign relations, this sort of dance of negotiation between Britain and America. Now, we get a hint right away from that early scene in the Oval Office. We get a hint that Alex is skeptical and resistant to this whole strategy. And he briefly tries to assert that there's another way that they can win without the Midwest.
I'd argue that you don't actually need the Midwest, and there's a path to re-election without that you don't want to hear from me today.
But it's left till later to reveal what actually is this other strategy. So here we have strategy B, which seems to come from the mind of Alex. And this is to win the election by winning Texas. Alex tries to promote this idea internally within the White House and the Claremont team. Now, one way or another, his memo putting forward this plan is leaked to the press.
I read your Texas campaign memo.
How? That was super confidential.
I'm a journalist, Alex. I quite literally have my sources.
And Alex's and Ellen's hands are then forced.
Did you tell Miguel Ramos that we had a plan to flip Texas?
Alex is forced for his part to defend this alternative plan to President Claremont herself.
I was unaware my campaign had a new Texas strategy. Can you please tell me what it is?
If your campaign had read my memo, you'd know.
And that leads then to this crucial confrontation scene also in the Oval Office. And in these scenes, we don't get the details of exactly what Alex's strategy is. We never see the memo where he puts forward his plan. But we do get a little sketchy outline of the strategy when he has this argument with President Claremont. And it involves, you could say, a rapid-fire series of 3 sub-goals.
You do have a Texas strategy. You just won't implement it. Why aren't you registering 1 million new voters? Why aren't you firing up the youth vote, building a grassroots movement?
Firstly, fire up the youth vote. Secondly, build a grassroots movement. And third, register 1 million new voters. Now, there's a whole lot one could say about each of these little sub-goals that Alex puts forward in his strategy. And we don't know exactly what his full thoughts are because it's never fleshed out. But we get this contrast between 2 pathways to re-election, one going through the Midwest and one through Texas. And this fairly simple difference in electoral strategy quickly gets freighted with a lot of moral and ideological meaning. It's symbolic. So if we look at this Oval Office confrontation scene, it is the most pivotal and crucial in understanding the political ideology of the film. And it sets up a series of binary oppositions which reinforce one another and which define the sort of structure through which the movie makes sense of the world. So ostensibly, it seems as if this is just about geographic strategy, right? That's what it is on the surface, winning Texas versus winning the Midwest. But this takes on tremendous ideological freight. So Alex adamantly defends his Texas proposal. And what's most revealing is how he defends it. So he casts his Texas plan as representing not just an alternative way of deploying resources to try to win electoral votes, but more than that, he presents it as an entirely different vision and style of campaign, or even you could say a different style of politics altogether. So he makes no reference to strategic considerations like whether Texas can realistically be won, what it would cost in terms of money and labor, or what benefit it would give in terms of electoral votes. So in other words, we never hear any cost-benefit analysis. Instead, Alex appeals to emotion and uses emotional terms, referring to Texas as Ellen's home state.
Why aren't you fighting for your home state, Ma?
So he invokes a sentimental connection to Texas, and folding the tactic of winning Texas into a litany of other tactics that seem to reflect a broader, more ambitious style of campaign predicated upon large-scale mobilization that he wants Ellen to adopt. So as we saw, registering 1 million new voters, firing up the youth vote, building a grassroots movement. So there's language here of energy, of motion. His comments seem to imply, in an indirect way, that Texas, for some reason, would be more responsive to this kind of broad, ambitious campaign strategy than the Midwest would be, although it's never spelled out why. So at this juncture, there are many possibilities of how Ellen might respond. For one thing, she could question the apparent premises and assumptions in Alex's argument. For example, she might question, why would your strategies like firing up the youth vote and registering new voters not work just as well in the Midwest as in Texas? Are there not young people in the Midwest? Are there not many unregistered voters in the Midwest? And further, I would question, as a viewer, how could Ellen build up a grassroots movement? Ellen is the President of the United States. She's the highest-ranking government official in the nation. She can't build up a grassroots movement because if it's conceived from the top down, from the White House, then by definition, it's not grassroots. The whole idea here seems contradictory. But rather than pointing out these sort of gaps in Alex's reasoning, instead she seeks to discredit Alex's whole approach and mindset. So Ellen here uses 3 strategies to try to discredit and refute Alex's proposal. And each one of these also has implied assumptions. So firstly, she reminds Alex of her overarching goals. She says she is fighting for her administration,
I am fighting for my administration.
and she insists that she will not be the first woman to lose re-election to this office. Now, this could be seen as a non sequitur. Don't both of them, Alex and Ellen, both want her to be reelected? Isn't that the shared goal? And isn't this just an argument about how best to accomplish that goal? So in this way, her response could be seen to imply certain things. It implies that Alex's strategy has some other motive to it, other than just ensuring her reelection. Apparently, she believes he wants to prove some point or achieve some other secondary emotional or ideological goal. And it implies further that if they follow his strategy, they will lose. So presumably it's impractical, although she does not say so directly. Secondly, Ellen shows Alex polling numbers from the Rust Belt, this sort of colloquial term for the upper Midwest, the sort of region around the Great Lakes.
Richards is killing me in the Rust Belt. That's where we need to focus, not Texas.
And Ellen insists that they should be focusing there and not on Texas. Now, she doesn't explain the precise reasoning as to why. Presumably, it's just because the margins there are closer, and so maybe those states are more winnable than Texas. Or maybe it's because she has an economic plan that she thinks will be effective in the upper Midwest. But this is not stated, it's left ambiguous. Now, perhaps at this point, Ellen or Alex could get down to brass tacks, and they might compare the number of electoral votes at stake in the different states, the closeness of the polling margins, the number of votes that could be swayed, and the likely effectiveness of campaign time and money being spent in different regions, where it would have the greatest chance of tipping the Electoral College in Ellen's favor. And perhaps Ellen might win this argument. I think, if we're going based on reality outside the film, she would win this argument. The fact is, Texas is a red state. It has not voted blue for a presidential election since 1976. Whereas the Midwest has many competitive swing states like Michigan and Wisconsin that were crucial tipping points in the real elections of both 2016 and 2020. And three of these states in particular, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, together have a total of 44 electoral votes, whereas Texas has only 40. And there's a great irony that at the end of the film, on election night, everything ends up hinging on Texas. Yet we see on the map that Ellen has already lost Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And if she had carried those states, then she would have won by that point, even with or without Texas. But rather than getting into all of this sort of political brass tacks, instead, Ellen finally tries to clinch her argument by making an abstract ideological value judgment. So she says to Alex, quote, "You're being idealistic when I need you to be realistic."
You're being idealistic when I need you to be realistic.
So this line, I think, is the most important to unlocking the ideology of the whole movie. So she labels Alex's plan and strategy as idealistic as opposed to realistic. So this line then implies clearly that these two principles are opposed, right? With Alex's strategy based on the first, idealism, while it violates the dictates of the latter, realism. What is more, Alex accepts and embraces this premise. He does not question it. He doesn't try to say, well, my strategy is realistic too. I've done the numbers. Instead, he accepts Ellen's premise that his strategy is idealistic while hers is realistic. And when Ellen says, I need you to be realistic, Alex retorts, is that why you got into politics? To be realistic?
Is that why you got into politics? To be realistic? Do you think that's what the people really need right now?
And I think I remember seeing this scene and sort of rolling my eyes a bit and saying, yes, Alex taking a strong stand against realism. That's a great argument. But what's important here, regardless, is that both characters, although they are arguing different positions about strategy, both of them together accept a shared premise, and that is that their conflicting strategies represent a fundamental clash between two modes of politics, or even two basic principles of life, idealism versus realism. And what is more, this then serves to set up a whole further set of binary oppositions, where Alex's and Ellen's competing strategies take on further symbolic meaning. So we see in this scene these two contrasting characters, right? Alex and Ellen, one a young man and the other a mature woman. And they are set up as representing idealism versus realism, passion versus calculation, ambition and risk-taking versus caution, and appeal to sentiment versus appeal to material interests. And all of this, by implication, is represented and expressed through the different regions of the country that they seek to target in order to win the election. Texas versus the Midwest. So these two places, these geographic places, then take on symbolic meanings based in large part on regional stereotypes, which tie them, these two regions, further to the past and the future. So Texas, in sort of current commentary and punditry, Texas is often taken to represent the new and vital center of the country, the so-called Sun Belt, whereas the Midwest is seen as outmoded and moribund, the proverbial Rust Belt, which must be consigned to inevitable decline and irrelevance. And further, these characters and these regions of Texas and the Midwest are taken to represent youth versus maturity. And this contrast is then further illustrated in the montage that follows, where we see Alex actually campaigning in Texas. And he's talking to people, running an organization, meeting voters, corralling people in, going and appearing before the media. And everyone that we see in these scenes in Texas is young. It's presented as this sort of land of sun, energy, brightness, and youth. And finally, this contrast of youth versus maturity is personified by the characters themselves, right, who come to represent naivety versus experience. And this finally comes out in Ellen's final retort, where she says, "I do not need a lecture from you about idealism."
I do not need a lecture from you about idealism.
And she explains that she used to be young and to have a small constituency, but now instead she's responsible for the whole nation.
I was 28 when I was elected to the state legislature. I had 150,000 constituents. Now I have 330 million.
Again, there's this contrast between past and future and between youth and maturity. And she sums up here that the people of the country, quote, need me to be realistic so they can be idealistic, end quote. Now, I remember thinking here, what does that mean exactly? I don't quite follow what she's saying. Is she saying that if you have a small number of constituents, then you don't need to be realistic? State legislators don't need to be realistic? Why not? If you're a legislator, then isn't realism very much needed in order to be effective and change laws and policies? And conversely, if you have reached a high leadership office like the presidency, does that mean then you should give up on your ideals? Just as you're in a position to possibly realize them, then you should give them up because they're somebody else's job? I don't really get it. So I think it's very valid for Alex to ask at this point, what do you mean? Are you saying that people want leaders without ideals? Or you could further probe, is idealism okay if you're the leader of a small country? Like, can the leader of Ireland or Singapore be idealistic, but not the leader of the United States because it's too big? I don't really get it. So this reasoning struck me from early on as very strange and confused, and it made me skeptical. Most importantly, it made me wary about this implied binary opposition that structures much of the rest of the film. This binary opposition can be seen to be echoed in the Henry affair plotline, where, in a sense, Henry asks Alex to be realistic and to accept Henry's situation, including his reluctance to come out publicly. Once again, Henry can be seen to represent the old world, right? The past, and lack of ambition, lack of courage, lack of idealism. And Alex, for his part, pushes Henry forward to take the risk for the sake of his own happiness and authenticity. So again, this binary opposition is at work, I think, in both plotlines. And this parallel is underscored by visual references in the film that link Alex's desire for Henry to his attachment to Texas. But most importantly, it really defines the political plot, where the president is soon persuaded to take the risk of supporting Alex's Texas plan, and then Alex pulls it off. And on election night, we see Ellen lose the upper Midwest because apparently her realistic strategy failed. But her skin is saved by narrowly winning Texas, so Alex's gamble paid off. Hence, in this sense, realistic calculation is shown to be an exhausted dead end, whereas idealistic ambition represents the future. So the end of the film can be seen as a vindication of idealism, as represented, for one thing, in Ellen's victory speech, in which Ellen refutes the sort of cynical idea that elections don't matter, and we'll get to that. So all in all, you could say the message of the film could be taken as something like idealism can win against cynical realism. And this makes sense, too, with what Casey McQuiston has said about the evolution of the idea, right? Where it was supposed to be a satire, but then they changed the tone and thrust of the story to be more inspiring and uplifting. But, as I have been implying all along here, one has to question, does this binary opposition between idealism and realism make sense in the first place? Let's say we look more specifically at this argument over electoral strategy. Why is winning Texas any more idealistic than winning the Midwest? So certainly it may be more far-fetched, and it may in fact be unrealistic. I would guess that it is. But in what sense is it more idealistic? Don't the residents of the Midwest also have dreams and aspirations and inherent value just as much as Texans do? Is a vote from Michigan or Ohio not just as valuable and meaningful as a vote from Texas? And is the fact that it is more realistically achievable to win, for instance, Wisconsin, mean that therefore it's less worthwhile or less noble of an aim? Now, perhaps there are good responses to these questions, and perhaps some might come to mind to some viewers watching this video. But I would like to present an alternate point of view on this whole idea of an opposition between idealism and realism. So from my perspective, I do not see these two principles as opposed in the first place. I see this as a false binary. Realism and idealism, in my view, are not opposites or even necessarily in tension with one another. They're not in conflict because they answer different questions. Idealism is a matter of ends. What ends or goals do you see as worth pursuing? Realism is a matter of means. What sort of methods are most likely to realize those ends or goals? So if I were to briefly define idealism, I would describe it as being motivated by one's higher principles and aspirations, right? One's ideals as to how the world ought to be. Some synonyms might be altruism, caring about others' needs and interests, principledness, high-mindedness. Some opposites would include selfishness, hedonism, right? The pursuit of pleasure over and above everything else, and materialism. And it happens that in philosophical terminology, these two are opposites, idealism and materialism. Although they mean something a little different, it's a slightly different sense. But it can apply in everyday ethics as well, right? Idealism means being motivated by ideas, right? What you most value, what you most believe in, whereas materialism is a matter of pursuing self-gratification through material things. Now, what then is realism? Well, I would just describe realism as having a good practical understanding of how the world works. And synonyms include practicality, pragmatism, clear-headedness. Antonyms, opposites, would include foolhardiness, recklessness, and naivety. So I would say there is no necessary conflict or tension between these two principles. And indeed, I would say that most great endeavors require a combination of both. And I think that this sense is captured very well in a line from Alexander Pope's essay on man, which he wrote in the 1700s. He was a great sort of pithy philosophical poet. And he wrote in his essay on man, "On life's vast ocean diversely we sail, reason the card, but passion is the gale." So here he's using a sailing metaphor, right? Passion is the gale, meaning feeling, hope, aspiration, conviction. These provide the motivation to act and to take risks in the world, while reason is the card. So card here meaning the plate of a compass that shows you the cardinal directions. So reason provides the direction, the plan of how to get from here to there. So any plan or endeavor, I would say, can be realistic, idealistic, both, or neither. For instance, one could imagine projects or goals that are idealistic but not realistic, like establish a perfect utopian city, find the elixir of immortality, create a time machine. Or others that are realistic but are not idealistic, that are selfish or materialistic, such as make millions in corporate law or by gaming the stock market. And this is not to say that these things are wrong. If someone wants to make millions in corporate law, fine, more power to them. But they're not idealistic. There are other endeavors that might be both idealistic and realistic. Say, helping your community as a nurse or a teacher, organizing your neighborhood or workplace, or creating music or art that you consider uplifting. And there are others that, rarely ever appear on our radar because they are neither idealistic nor realistic. So what we have here, I would say, is two independent variables, and it is absolutely possible to practice both of them together. Indeed, I would say the most admired undertakings that we most remember and celebrate are those that spring from a combination of both. And I would say that the people we most admire, the leaders we most admire, are those that are both realistic and idealistic at once. Being idealistic does not mean being naive. People who achieve their highest aims, or you could say have a meaningful impact on people's lives, they are ones that take on a difficult and high-minded mission while fully aware of the obstacles that stand in the way and the risks of failure. So finally, I think all of this matters here because those who set up realism and idealism against each other are, I would say, trying to pull one over on us. And many of you maybe will know what I'm referring to when I say that often one hears things like, yes, you are young and naive, so you can be idealistic, but once you grow older and more mature and have experienced the real world, then you'll get over your idealism. Now, this really gets my goat because, for one thing, it's a non sequitur, right? Understanding the workings of the world as it is makes no difference to the question of whether you want to change it for the better, according to your highest values or ideals. And I would tend to guess that those people who set up this false binary, they do so in order to excuse their own lack of idealism. In other words, their own decision to opt for selfish materialism rather than for something more valuable and meaningful. Now, whether or not one agrees with my supposition about why some people would set up this false opposition, the logical non sequitur of it is captured, I think, very well by G.K. Chesterton, who was a Christian philosopher in Britain in the early 1900s and who proudly called himself an idealist. And he wrote in his book Orthodoxy a passage that I think captures this frustration that I'm trying to get at. And he wrote, quote, "When the businessman rebukes the idealism of his office boy, it is commonly in some such speech as this. Yes, when one is young, one has these ideals in the abstract and these castles in the air. But in middle age, they all break up like clouds, and one comes down to a belief in practical politics, to using the machinery one has and getting on with the world as it is. Thus at least venerable and philanthropic old men now in their honored graves used to talk to me when I was a boy. But since then I have grown up and have discovered that these philanthropic old men were telling lies. What has really happened is exactly the opposite of what they said would happen. They said that I should lose my ideals and begin to believe in the methods of practical politicians. Now, I have not lost my ideals in the least. My faith in fundamentals is exactly what it always was. What I have lost is my old childlike faith in practical politics." End quote. So what I think Chesterton is bringing out here is a very basic logical point, that even if it is true that idealism and practicality might come into conflict, that does not mean that practicality has to win out, nor that wise or mature or worldly people have to abandon idealism. Indeed, disillusionment with the world as it is can just as validly reinforce one's idealism. So why have I been harping on this? Well, because this binary opposition is central to the putative message of Red, White, and Royal Blue. And although you might say, well, ultimately idealism is vindicated, nonetheless, why does that mean it's defeated realism? Why are these two things set up as opposed in the first place? It is misleading, or you could say problematic, that these two are set up in opposition and that this opposition is never questioned afterwards, as far as I have seen. Maybe I'm wrong. Perhaps other people might interpret it differently. But it seems to me as if even this sort of fairy tale happy ending still keeps that binary opposition in place. And this central opposition then in turn underpins a whole tangled web of assumptions and implicit value judgments. And these value judgments, I would say, reflect a particular ideological perspective. So ideologies in general are more implicit and unspoken than explicitly stated. They tend to involve a lot of embedded assumptions that help to protect the interests and rationalize the choices of particular social groups, right? They're often tied to a group or a party or a class. I would posit that Red, White, and Royal Blue reflects the ideology of the educated American middle class in the 21st century, which is the main defining base of the Democratic Party. And this movie, for one thing, it is explicitly partisan. This is a movie about Democrats contending with and defeating Republicans. And the educated middle class might not be the main voting base of the party in terms of sheer numbers, but they do tend to set the ideological tone and agenda of the party. So suppose we go back to this first chart with this list of binary pairs. Well, in the light of the perspective that I presented about realism and idealism, one could ask, is it right to say that Alex's strategy is more idealistic than Ellen's? I don't see any reason why. Their goal is the same, getting Ellen reelected. They're just two different routes to the same destination. But the film certainly implies that winning Texas is somehow better. It's more admirable, more idealistic in the sense of elevated, meaningful, as compared to winning the Midwest, which is implied to be more cynical or hollow. But why? Well, Alex's electoral strategy symbolizes what the liberal middle class implicitly values. So Texas represents the youthful and vital side of the scales. It's the place where Alex and Henry are most free. Specifically, Alex and his family are from Austin, which is a place that is famously youthful and hip, a center of music and entertainment. And this fits then with the broader image of Texas's role in the nation. Texas is the very buckle of the Sun Belt, understood to be growing, vital, dynamic, prosperous from oil, technology, and publishing, associated with the future. By contrast, Ellen Claremont refers to the Midwest as the Rust Belt, invoking common associations of that region with age, decline, and decay. And this sort of mentality, this stark contrast in how people view the Midwest as opposed to Texas, this mentality can be seen to emerge originally in the 1970s. And it involves dividing the country between old and new, and basically consigning the industrial regions and industrial workers to the past. And I'll discuss this more later. But also there's more to it than just that. The Texas strategy, as we saw, is also built on different methods of appeal. So Alex's vision involves appeals to passion and emotion, firing up. And in trying to persuade Ellen, he refers to Texas as your own home state, right? A place with sentimental connection. But Alex does not point to any actual tangible material benefits that they could deliver to Texans in order to win their support. While by contrast, Ellen does have a concrete policy plan that she thinks can deliver tangible benefits to the Midwest in return for their votes. Now, I would say that this is most of the actual stuff of politics in most communities most of the time. Politics is about the creation and disposition of power and resources in society. And the business of politics, you could say, is the cultivation of alliances and building of coalitions through shared material interests. And hence, it is necessarily conflictual to some degree. It involves the advancement of some interests at the expense of others. And this may sometimes seem like a bit vulgar or unseemly, but inherently there's nothing wrong with it. It's just part of the human condition that we have to figure out and debate how to live together and to share resources. Yet ironically, it is precisely for this reason that winning the Midwest is not idealistic in the scheme of this film. In other words, it would involve getting their hands dirty by actually trying to win people's support by furthering their material interests. So appeals to sentiment are better or purer than appeals to material interests. And this is reinforced, I think, by how the movie ends. So the whole plot line of the trade deal that ran through the first two acts of the movie is just dropped. We never find out whether any agreement was ever signed with Great Britain, nor what was in it, or whether it had any effect on the election. We're left with the implication that people voted for Ellen Claremont more on the basis of Alex and Henry's affair than on any actual tangible economic issues. And one could say this seems unrealistic. And some would just shrug, of course, and say, well, this is not a realistic movie, so what's the big deal? But I would counter that in some respects it is a very realistic movie. It's just that this political aspect is lacking in depth or nuance. So what I would posit is that the film reflects and reinforces a view of politics that focuses on appeals to broad sentiment, personal feelings, and personality, and that avoids or suppresses discussion of tangible material interests, which in contrast are seen as low-minded, vulgar, or uncouth. And so in this way, this mentality and this approach to politics discourages actual material change, and in this way protects the status quo. Now, again, one might think I'm being too harsh or too cynical myself. Does this film ever actually say that there's anything wrong with the tangible stuff of politics, with the dirty work of building coalitions by advancing material interests? And I would say no, not explicitly, but it does by implication and by omission. The ideology of the film is seen not just in what is said, but more so in what is not said. The lacunae, the gaps, what is left out. Just like how the whole issue of the trade deal gets dropped, so many other things that would have made the film more complete and believable as a portrayal of politics are left out. So let's talk now about what is missing, in my view. So consider, for one, what do we know about Ellen Claremont's administration? We know that she is very young. She started out in electoral politics in her 20s when she ran for the Texas State House. She had some sort of meteoric rise to the presidency. And in the book, there is reference to her being in Congress at some point, but this is not explicitly mentioned in the film. We know also that she has put in a lot of time and effort into negotiating a trade deal with the UK.
Thousands of hours, gallons of tea.
Now, beyond that, what are her policy views and positions? Where does she stand on taxes, energy, or healthcare? Who are her allies in politics, other than, her husband? What constituencies support her? All of this is left out, which I think has the effect of lowering the stakes of the election. It's reduced to just a personal contest between two people. Most of all, we don't know, what is Ellen's vision? How does she want to see the government or the country change? One could say, in other words, what are her ideals? What does she want the impact of her administration to be? And this absence leads then to strange ironies in the lines that she gives in the confrontation scene with Alex in the Oval Office. So in this confrontation scene, we hear Alex challenge Ellen, "Why aren't you fighting for your home state?" And Ellen responds, "I'm fighting for," and then if we pause there for a moment, I might have expected her to say something revealing that might explain why she believes it's so important for her to be reelected, such as, I'm fighting for women's basic freedoms that are on the line, or I'm fighting for children to not have to go through the things my family did when I was young. But instead she says, I'm fighting for my administration. Well, isn't this kind of obvious? Didn't we already know that? This is not at issue. It seems circular. Do you just believe that you should be president because you should be president? What's the point of all this? She then continues in this scene and says, for my administration and for the people who can't afford, and then I'll pause us here again for a second. What is she about to say? Maybe she's going to say for people who can't afford to go to the doctor, or can't afford to feed their kids, or can't afford a home. But instead of any of these, she says, who can't afford to have Jeffrey Richards become president.
And for the people who can't afford to have Jeffrey Richards become president.
Again, I would say, okay, we already know that you don't want him to be president, but why? What exactly is lost here in concrete terms if Richard does become president? In other words, Ellen never tells us what are the ramifications of her losing this election apart from her losing. There's no suggestion here of what is actually at stake for the public. Now, we can probably guess and fill in the blanks, right? He's a Republican, he's probably bad, wants to do all kinds of discriminatory things or harm government services, but the movie could have at least given us some hint here. And they could have done it, as I suggested, through lines that are even more succinct than what Ellen actually says. So one has to ask, why leave this out? And thinking about it, I get the sense that the answer is something like, because it's not that kind of movie. Filling in those gaps and telling us what Ellen is actually fighting for, what her administration actually stands for, that would in some way be too controversial. But then we can think, isn't this ironic? Because this is a movie about a gay love affair between the son of the US president and a British prince. So it's not a movie that's afraid of controversy. Yet still, there's something that this movie is avoiding. And I would posit it is, for one thing, the sense that politicians ought to be expected to deliver something to the public. And the idea that they shouldn't just be chosen because of who they are or because they're good people, but that they should be judged by the substantive changes that they make that affect people's lives materially. And I think that perhaps, if we put these elements together, perhaps this is exactly what the movie is implicitly casting as realistic politics. It's using this word realistic to stand in for coalition building based on class and material interests. This form of politics is implied to be outmoded, crass, or lowbrow, and it should be superseded by the politics of idealism in the sense of sentiment, personality, rather than material interests. And more specifically, class and regional politics, it seems, should be replaced by generational politics, right, and the cult of youth. And if we consider Alex's idealism, whatever we take that to mean, his idealism seems to be vindicated in the end when Ellen wins Texas, and hence the election. But the election, as we saw, is very close. It comes down to the wire and down to a few votes in a few precincts in Texas. So this implies that she might have lost, right? That whole denouement about the election would have no tension to it. If there wasn't at least that possibility, she might lose. And this is an interesting alternate possibility to think about, which raises certain questions. To begin with, how would we feel about the film if she did lose? I think, it sounds very depressing, right? It would throw a huge wet blanket over the whole film. It would seem like a massive failure and disappointment. And what this suggests then is that the point of Ellen Claremont's term in office is basically just to get another term in office. There's no clear legacy we can point to here that she leaves behind, absent winning re-election. Ending with a loss would be very sad, mainly for personal reasons. Most of all for Alex, who probably would blame himself and be consumed with guilt and anger. It would be really an ugly scene, right? But would it really even be Alex's fault? What were the other factors at work in this election, other than this scandal about Alex and Henry? We really don't know. Do the people have other issues that they care about, other than Alex's love life? Did people stand to lose or gain their health care, or lose or gain housing, or lose or gain basic rights? Or did they risk being sent to a war zone or brought back home? Maybe these things would rather ruin the escapist fantasy, but then doesn't that raise the further question, why do we want to see politics as a sort of game with low stakes? What makes this appealing? And I want to push this further by asking, could we imagine another version of the film where Ellen does lose, but it is not depressing, maybe just bittersweet? For instance, Alex and Henry get to be together and they win in that sense, but just not in the electoral sense. This may be difficult for us to picture, but I think it is conceivable. In order for this sort of ending to happen, it would have to be a pretty different kind of film. It would have to be one where the Claremont administration has clear goals and does achieve some of them, thus really affecting people's lives. And those achievements stand, whether or not Ellen is reelected. And this whole question made me think repeatedly as I was going through this film, trying to break it down, asking these questions. I thought repeatedly of Ann Richards, who was a very outspoken Democratic governor of Texas in the early 1990s. And it's hard not to think of Richards as a point of comparison to Ellen Claremont. So Ann Richards came from a modest, ordinary background in Texas.
I was born during the Depression in a little community just outside Waco, and I grew up listening to Franklin Roosevelt on the radio.
Her father was a salesman, and according to her family, as a little girl, she used to wear dresses made from recycled animal feed sacks. When she grew up, she was a school teacher and a mother of 4 before she got into Democratic organizing. In 1976, she was first elected as a commissioner of Travis County, which is the county in Texas that includes Austin. Then in 1982, she was elected as the Texas state treasurer. She thoroughly overhauled and modernized the Treasury. She also was unabashedly feminist and was open about being a recovering alcoholic. In 1988, she was asked to give the keynote address at the Democratic National Convention. She was only the second woman ever to make the keynote address at a Democratic convention.
Because after listening to George Bush all these years, I figured you needed to know what a real Texas accent sounds like.
And she made a huge national impression, especially for her wit and humor and for challenging the Bush dynasty, which was from her own home state of Texas. 2 years later, in 1990, she was elected as governor of Texas, and she ran a progressive administration. In her inaugural address, she famously declared, "Welcome to the new Texas."
A glimpse of the possibilities of what can happen in government if we simply open the doors and let the people in.
In her term in office, she brought in women and people of color into government and law enforcement. And incidentally, in 1991, she was visited in Austin by Queen Elizabeth of Great Britain and her husband, Prince Philip. And this was the first time that a British monarch had ever been to Texas. And reportedly, the Queen and Prince Philip made this visit because they saw Texas at this moment as representing the future of the United States. So Ann Richards was a great performer, but she also was a diligent and effective legislator.
We are here to serve the people and improve the conditions of their lives.
She increased penalties in Texas for polluters, redistributed funds to poorer public schools.
This is a woman who had not served as a member of the legislature, but she helped change the mind of 4 state senators in 3 hours' time. She had the acumen and the promise.
She tackled graft, nepotism, and influence peddling in state government and got the legislature to pass an ethics bill curtailing their own business activities.
The revolving door, that convenient little arrangement that shuttles officials into cushy jobs with industries they regulate, is shut.
And she started substance abuse treatment programs, including in prisons, which was very important to her because she was a recovering addict herself. Now, it seems hard to imagine that the author Casey McQuiston and the filmmakers of Red, White, and Royal Blue could have possibly not known of Ann Richards, and that she would not have been a model for Ellen Claremont. But ironically, her name and office are assigned to Ellen's opponent, Governor Richards. It's just a sort of weird concurrence I don't really know what to make of there. But regardless, the big difference that you can see between the careers of Ann Richards and Ellen Claremont is that Ann lost re-election. In 1994, she was defeated by George W. Bush in a campaign run by Karl Rove, his first campaign, and their message focused on abortion, guns, and crime. Now, in her concession speech the night of that election, she said, quote, "This isn't the end of the world, it's the end of a campaign."
I don't want any of us to go home with anything but a great deal of pride in our hearts. We had a great 4 years.
And after the election, she addressed her staff in the State House, and she said, quote, "Everyone I see says, 'How do you feel?' And the answer to that is, 'I feel wonderful,'" end quote. And although she had acknowledged that she was disappointed to have lost the election, nonetheless she pointed to how much she had done in her 18 years in public office, concluding with the 4 years as governor. And moreover, in a farewell press conference, a journalist asked her, "What would you have done differently if you had known that you would be a one-term governor?" And she famously said, quote, "Well, I would probably have raised more hell." So she didn't hide that she was disappointed, but she never showed that she was upset about losing, and she never wanted to run again for office. She maintained that she was proud of what she had accomplished and the impact her administration had had in Texas. So what's the significance of all this? What lesson can we take from it? Well, what I would take, for one thing, is that elections are unpredictable by definition. If there was some way to guarantee that you would be reelected, then there would be no point in having elections. So hence, one should not see re-election as the overarching point or goal. That's simply a bonus. Instead, the goal should be to see what you can achieve in the term that you are actually given. And further, I would say there is something hollow and circular about seeing re-election as the be-all, end-all of one's political career. This reduces politics to merely a game, rather than an arena of endeavor in which one tries to make life better for other people.
Cynicism has always been there. The media will always be there, but the system will always be there waiting for you to breathe new life into it.
So this brings us then to the final part of the film, where we see Ellen Claremont's victory, and we hear her victory speech, which is the last explicitly political scene of the movie. And this is maybe the best encapsulation of all the things that I think are missing and oddly absent from the film. So Ellen here has won by swinging her home state of Texas, and she chooses to address the skeptics in the public, those people who say that, quote, elections don't matter.
There are people who will tell you that elections don't matter.
And Ellen doesn't discuss exactly who says this or why, but she is right, I think, that this is a common sentiment that's been expressed many times through American history, as in the old saying, if voting worked, then it would be illegal. This is an adage that's been repeated in many forms and attributed to many different people, but it's just a common sense in America. And as this saying reflects, the cynicism is rooted in the perception that regardless of who wins an election, the policies won't change, society won't change, and real power will remain in place. It's all a case, you could say, of meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So this is a very long-known idea, and it's perhaps even more common today in recent years, where there's a lot of cynicism about politics. Now, one might expect then for Ellen in her victory speech to address this cynicism and refute it by pointing out everything that her administration has in fact done and all the changes that they now intend to do with a second term. But she conspicuously does not do that. Instead, she attempts to rebut the cynics by saying, quote, "But try telling that to the auto worker in Michigan who worries whether or not their plant will shut down. Tell that to the transgender high school student in Mississippi voting for the very first time. Elections do matter because they give you a voice, and your voice is blended tonight with the voices of millions of Americans just like you, open-hearted, fearless, and alive to a bolder, brighter, braver future." End quote. So let's break this part down a bit. So firstly, Ellen cites two imagined voters, an auto worker and a transgender high school student, and she implies or assumes that this election does matter for them. She then argues that elections matter to you, the non-specific member of the general public, because they give you a voice. And finally, she describes people who voted tonight, or presumably those who voted for her, as being fearless and forward-looking. So let's say we start with this middle part. This is where Ellen explicitly puts forward why elections matter. And it's not because of any tangible effects or results that they might bring about, but rather it's because they, quote, give you a voice, which is then blended with others' voices. So this is like basically the definition of an election. Everyone who's eligible casts a vote, and those are then aggregated together to form a total. And this statement, I think, is basically an instance of the circularity that I alluded to, right? Elections matter inasmuch as elections happen. Voting matters because voting matters. Yet if the argument can't be backed up by pointing to tangible results that those elections bring about in the world, then the cynics have not been refuted, and the whole exercise would seem to be just a hollow ritual. And in fact, there is a good case to be made, and some political scientists like Fox and Piven have pointed this out, that elections really are mainly a civic ritual to begin with, and people participate in them more as a way of affirming their sense of citizenship than out of any real hope that their ballots will change the outcome, or even that the outcome will change laws or policies. Now, to be fair here, Ellen does almost allude in a vague way to some more specific concrete policy issues in her opening line. So here she refers to two putative voters who presumably are invested in this election, an auto worker and a transgender high school student.
But try telling that to the auto worker in Michigan who worries whether or not their plant will be shut down.
And certainly both of them have serious issues that they have to worry about. But Claremont does not explain precisely why either one of them would see this election as a solution to those fears or concerns. As for the auto worker, perhaps we can suppose that Ellen hopes that her trade deal will come through and benefit them, although we never learn what became of that whole trade deal nor how it might have been expected to help them. Then as for the transgender high school student, I found this line to be especially flummoxing, since it struck me, on the one hand, as extremely specific.
Tell that to the transgender high school student in Mississippi, voting for the very first time.
How many transgender Mississippian high school student first-time voters do you think there are in a given election year? But I had expected that perhaps at this point Ellen might explain why this election was so critical and impactful for that particular variety of voter. But no, instead she just says voting for the very first time. And this again seems to underscore this pattern of hollow circularity. Voting matters because voting matters, or elections matter because elections happen. Moreover, Ellen seems to assume that this putative high school student would be voting for her. She doesn't say this, but it seems to be implied. But can we actually presume that? Do we know? A big problem, as some of you might have heard, a big problem for Democrats and Democratic strategists in the past decade or so is that they have assumed that certain demographic groups, such as minorities and young people, are necessarily going to vote for them overwhelmingly. Yet at very important junctures, they don't do so. Their votes turn out to be more split. And so we cannot assume how this putative transgender high school student in Mississippi is going to vote without knowing more about their particular lives, beliefs, or priorities. Nonetheless, with both of these voters, the auto worker and the high school student, they both remain non-specific archetypes. They're sort of demographic tokens or pixels in a much larger map, and in this way they fade into this anonymous public mass. And this is in keeping, I think, with a consistent rule in this film, which is that we never hear anything specific about or from ordinary people. They're just in the background, and they're not really characters or actors. So if we look at the makeup of the cast of characters in this film and who is seen and who is not, almost everyone we encounter in this film is either a royal, a member of the first family, or a member of their staff. Really, the one exception, the one person who appears on screen who isn't any of those things, is the reporter Miguel, who, for his part, is still a member of the political world, right? He's a Politico reporter, and he's also a generally bad character. He's smug and scheming, and evidently a villain, since it seems as if he probably was involved in outing Alex and Henry. So, if he's taken as a representative of the press, right, the Fifth Estate, as it's been called, then the press does not come out looking very good in this movie either. Now, the only character that we hear from, I would say, who is from outside the political and royal worlds and comes across effectively as an ordinary person is Alex's bodyguard, Amy, who is played by Anish Sheth. And I would say this is the best supporting performance in the movie. Amy comes across as effectively quirky and peculiar, but at the same time practical and grounded.
I need your help.
Where's the threat? Do we need to clear the room?
What?
So we get a real sense of her personality, again, largely thanks to Anish Sheth's performance. But still, we learn nothing about her background or needs or political perspective. Almost by definition, she has to be apolitical. And further, we never hear anything at all from ordinary citizens outside of the Washington and London bubble. We evidently see them appearing on screen in the Texas montage, and we see moments of their reactions. You know, some of them like what Alex is up to, some don't. But we learn nothing at all about their material interests or conditions of life. We see a hotel maid taking a photo with Alex, and we can surmise at least what her occupation is. But past that, we know nothing about what she thinks or wants or needs. And this is especially ironic, I think, considering that in his speech at the Democratic Convention, Alex says that the administration will be focused on your dreams, your needs, your priorities, etc.
Her vision for America has you at the center, your hopes, your values, your future.
And this irony finally comes out as well, I think, at the very end of the film. So in the last act, the public is actually the hero. There's a double ending where in Britain, Henry is basically saved by the crowds that form in his support around Buckingham Palace and other sites around Britain. But we never hear what those people have to say, nor even see them directly. They only appear as faint, blurry reflections in the windows. And then on the American side of the pond, Alex is saved by the voters of the American public. But again, we do not see them at all, nor do we get any hint as to why they voted the way they did. So the public here, in both parallel places, in Britain and in America, the public functions as a kind of deus ex machina. They swoop in and save the day, but we don't know how or why. Now, lastly, this movie does mention class several times, but it is only invoked in reference to the first family, where Alex refers to himself as being working class. But, as his own father points out, now he lives in a palace, right? So that was just the background he came from. It might be interesting to know, what does it mean to Alex to be working class? What sort of experiences does he associate with that background? And what were the material conditions of his upbringing? The only clue that we get in this respect is the house that we see on screen in the very last scene. And as we see Alex and Henry go into this house, Henry jokes, "You really are working class."
Wow, you really are working class, aren't you?
Oh, shut up, Your Majesty.
Which I think is very ironic, because if you look at it, that is a solidly middle-class home. Right? That is a detached, two-story, single-family home with a nice yard on a street in Austin, Texas. That might be on the upper side of middle class. But regardless of all that, say we forgive that. I don't know why Matthew and the other filmmakers didn't find a more working-class looking home. But putting that aside, we can ask, does Alex feel class solidarity with working people? And how does that factor into his political hopes or agenda? And further, we have to ask about conflict. Does Alex have class opponents or antagonists? And this goes to a broader question, too, about politics in this movie. Who has power in the world of this movie? Is there an opponent to Ellen and her administration, apart from just the Republican candidate or the press? Specifically, are there material interests opposed to Ellen Claremont and her agenda? Who is funding or supporting her opponents, and why? So these are important unanswered questions, which we'll go back to later. But all of this factors in then to the broader meta question, which is, why are there so many unanswered questions? Why does the movie avoid mentioning all these things like concrete policies or class or material interests? Well, I would say again, it's not just the result of time constraint. For one thing, this absence is similarly seen in the book that the movie is based on. So in the novel, there is a trade deal that Claremont is pursuing with Great Britain, and there is also a brief mention of Raphael Luna, a congressman who does not appear in the film, of Raphael Luna working to get free school lunches for students in his home state of Colorado. But as far as I can recall, those are the only mentions of actual policies in the whole book. Maybe there are others that others might remember, might point out, but that's all I could think of. Also in the book, we are told about Alex's plans for trying to win Texas, and he reportedly has a binder full of demographic data and voter rolls. But we never know how he hopes to persuade these voters and what needs or interests the campaign might appeal to in order to mobilize them. Again, they remain just as abstract data points. So the perspective that we get on the public and the voters is very limited. In a sense, they never really come to life. I also would say this absence of concrete material politics from the movie, it's also not the result of a fear of controversy, right? As we saw, this is about a gay affair between an American first son and a prince. The movie only avoids certain kinds of controversy, and I would posit that the real reason here is that the film reflects a certain ideology, which is prevalent in the Democratic Party in the 21st century, and the film must be understood in this context. So what is this context? It basically is democratic center-left politics of the early 21st century. So this movie is avowedly partisan in its premise. It is known explicitly that Ellen Claremont is a Democrat. Moreover, there are allusions, interesting allusions to past Democratic politicians woven into the film. There's the prominent image of FDR over the fireplace in the Oval Office. There is also an interesting subtle reference to Lyndon B. Johnson. So that was the president in the 1960s who oversaw the Great Society programs, but also lost public support because of the Vietnam War. So in the novel, the Claremont-Diaz lake house is on Lake LBJ in Texas, named after Lyndon Johnson. And in the film, in Alex's bedroom, in the scene where he has a phone conversation with Henry and then hangs up, we see on his bedstand a volume of Robert Caro's famous multi-volume biography of LBJ. So perhaps this is Alex's light bedtime reading. And this is a very interesting allusion. It suggests a parallel or resonance, since LBJ was a progressive Democrat from a working-class background in Texas. And moreover, Robert Caro's biography is remarkable for several reasons. It's extremely long and detailed, perhaps, in keeping with Alex's sort of obsessive and encyclopedic mind. 4 volumes of it have so far been published, and they add up together to about 3,000 pages. And this biography shows LBJ's insatiable drive and ambition, which propelled him from obscurity in Texas all the way to the White House. And this can be seen as a parallel to Alex's drive and relentlessness. More specifically, the particular volume that we see is titled The Means of Ascent, and it deals with LBJ's efforts trying to get elected to Congress, which we know Alex wants to do, and specifically also with a scandal. In this case, it was an election fraud scandal. That perhaps is another foreshadowing of the scandal that's going to engulf Alex and Henry. Now, another significant aspect to have in mind of Caro's biography of LBJ is that it shows LBJ's superb and deft management of coalitions to achieve policy goals. So the next volume after this one, after Means of Ascent, is titled Master of the Senate, and it deals with how LBJ, as a senator and then Senate Majority Leader, could build relationships around shared interests and get legislation passed. And this included even early civil rights legislation, even though LBJ came from a Southern white background and had started off his career as a segregationist. So this, I think, shows an ironic contrast. In Red, White, and Royal Blue, there's no actual discussion of how Ellen or Alex hope to build alliances around shared interests. Instead, what they seem to offer is, for one thing, symbolic and psychological value as examples, right? Ellen as a woman president. Part of why Ellen does not want to lose re-election is that she doesn't want to be seen to be defeated as a woman. And secondly, Alex and his father, Oscar, they are symbols being Latinos in the White House. And Alex describes their family's experience and refers to his father as an immigrant with a Z in his last name.
In America, if you're an immigrant with a Z in your last name, there's not a lot of people in positions of power that look like you or sound like you.
Which, interestingly, as viewers have pointed out, this also applies to the actor, Taylor Zakhar Perez, and the director, Matthew Lopez. So Alex clearly sees his role in politics as being a symbolic trailblazer.
I've been given a chance to be someone in the world that my father didn't see when he was growing up.
Now, this stands in contrast, then, with LBJ and his sort of role in politics, which was based on what you could deliver in terms of policy. But LBJ himself was not especially charismatic and, wasn't a regular old white Protestant man. But despite his sort of lack of charisma, he was able to move through legislation like the Great Society program, which created Medicare and Medicaid. And after great pressure from the Civil Rights Movement, he also helped to shepherd through the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. And we know that LBJ truly did play a direct, active role in cajoling, persuading, arm twisting, and favor trading to get that legislation enacted. And a lot of it is even documented and recorded in the LBJ tapes, where he recorded his phone calls.
We got a tax bill that they haven't touched. We got a civil rights bill that hadn't even passed the House. And it's November, and Hubert Humphrey told me yesterday everybody wanted to go home. But I'm going to ask the Congress Wednesday to just stay there. They pass them all. They won't do it, but we'll just keep them there next year till they do, and we just won't give up an inch.
So there's a huge difference here, right, between what LBJ seems to represent and what the politicians in Red, White, and Royal Blue are cast as representing. Now, this is not to say that the symbolic role of politicians is not significant or meaningful, and this is an aspect of the movie that spoke to many viewers. But it is to say that this is only one way in which politics has value, and one is not a substitute for the other, right? You can't pay the bills with symbolism. Now, also, as we saw, we do learn of one policy program that the Claremont administration is trying to enact, and that is the trade deal with Great Britain. So this plotline is interesting in that it does actually resonate with real recent history around the time when the book was written. So both the Trump and the Biden administrations carried out on-again, off-again talks about a free trade deal with Britain, specifically after the UK withdrew from the EU and needed new markets. But these talks never came to fruition, other than a very basic, sketchy, so-called economic prosperity deal by which the US and Britain agreed to keep tariffs low. And I don't even know if that deal has been adhered to. So why did this program fail in reality? Well, it was because of lack of commitment on the American side and also due to opposition in the Senate. So an important context here is that free trade deals were actually very controversial in the United States by 2020. And even before that, they've been a cause of conflict for decades in a way that often cuts across partisan lines, setting contending interests off against each other along lines of class and region, and often setting the base of each party at odds with their leadership. So just in brief, as for this context, From the post-World War II era through the 1980s, lowering trade barriers was generally seen as a Republican mission, and it was often opposed most of all by organized labor, which was concerned about the weakening of unions and the undercutting of wages by offshoring. Now, specifically, the idea of a trade agreement creating some kind of common market with the US, Canada, and Mexico was highly controversial and was a long-running struggle. The idea was first put forward by Ronald Reagan when he ran for president in 1980. It was then never really pursued in any serious way by Reagan when he was in the White House. But George H.W. Bush, after he came into office in 1989, he then negotiated the NAFTA treaty. And this treaty was strongly opposed by labor, who argued that it would undercut unions, devastate domestic manufacturing, and harm the industrial quarters of the country. So Bush could not get the deal passed through Congress. Then in 1992, in the presidential election that year, Bush and his Democratic opponent both said very little about NAFTA, and the issue was basically left then to the independent candidate Ross Perot, who famously warned that if the deal was enacted, a, quote, giant sucking sound would be heard as jobs moved out of the country to Mexico.
There will be a giant sucking sound going south.
Now, ultimately, Bill Clinton, the Democrat, ended up winning the three-way race with 43% of the vote. And after going into office, Clinton then threw his full weight behind passing NAFTA, and he was able to get it enacted in November 1993 using a cross-partisan combination of Democratic and Republican votes. Now, since that time, over the past 30 years, there has been a large net loss in manufacturing employment and in union membership from about 15% to under 10% in recent years. And there's a lot of serious debate as to why, and a lot of disagreement as to whether this was really the result of NAFTA. A lot of it was also due to automation and layoffs, but liberalized trade also played a big role in it. And arguably more so than NAFTA, it was PNTR, or Permanent Normalized Trade Relations with China, that then allowed for an enormous flood of cheap manufactured goods, largely made in the Pearl River Delta in southern China by workers with very little rights, to come into the US market and undermine the manufacturing sector. So this policy of permanent normalized trade relations with China actually, it seems, had a bigger impact than NAFTA, and it was also aggressively championed by Bill Clinton in his last years before leaving office. And coming as it did just a few years after NAFTA, this change in policy with China was seen to seal a shift where many Democrats, especially so-called New Democrats and members of centrist organizations like the DLC, these became champions of free trade, really just the same as Republicans, despite the opposition of organized labor. But it was not clear then what labor could do, since really the elites of both parties by the early 2000s were in favor of free trade deals. By the mid-2000s, the sort of alphabet soup of trade deals had become highly divisive. For instance, in July 2005, CAFTA, or the Central American Free Trade Agreement, basically modeled on NAFTA, CAFTA was enacted, but only after a very long struggle and intense pressure by congressional leaders, and it passed in a late-night session after midnight by a margin of only 2 votes. Now, Barack Obama came into office, of course, starting in 2009, and in his first term, he did not make trade a major issue. Domestic issues like Wall Street and healthcare dominated the debate. But his administration did begin to quietly negotiate a trade deal called TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would involve lowering certain trade barriers with countries around the Pacific, including Japan, Vietnam, and Malaysia. And this deal was arguably aimed at countering the rise of China as a hegemonic power in Asia. And Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, oversaw the initial discussions around TPP. And these then continued through Obama's second term. After 2015, Obama became determined to enact TPP. But whatever its merits, this deal began to loom as a real political danger to Hillary Clinton's campaign. It was seen as threatening another NAFTA or PNTR, and it inflamed distrust between labor and the Democratic Party. And specifically, the whole idea was widely reviled in the upper Midwest, right? This region that had been taken for granted as a blue wall. And this area started to become very close in places like Michigan and Wisconsin. And TPP was specifically associated with Clinton, since she was involved early on. So Clinton's campaign partly disavowed TPP, saying that the treaty failed to meet her, quote, high bar. But Clinton did not say specifically what she thought was wrong with the deal or under what conditions she might support it. So it ended up being a major issue in exactly the states that Clinton then narrowly and unexpectedly lost to Trump. And I think you could say that TPP was the biggest undiscussed and unacknowledged factor in the 2016 election. So hence, I think it's very ironic that this trade deal is the one and only policy project of the Claremont administration that we hear of. One could say on one level, it seems implausible that a trade deal would really be popular in an election race, especially in the Midwest. Would the public really trust that this deal was going to bring back jobs rather than destroy them? Perhaps they would, if they believed that this was a completely different kind of arrangement from NAFTA or PNTR. And that's conceivable since Britain is a manufacturing country, not a relatively impoverished developing country like Mexico or Vietnam. Hence, it's not such a great site for outsourcing jobs. But we can't say, since we don't know what any of the goals or terms of this trade deal were. One might also observe that I'm overthinking all of this, right? The trade deal is clearly just a plot device to create stakes for the relationship between Alex and Henry and a reason for them to have to get along with each other. And that's fair enough, but I also think that there is more to it than just that this trade deal also serves as a parallel to Henry and Alex's affair. And both of them, Henry and Alex's relationship and the trade deal, together both symbolize a kind of vision of a better, ideal future world of international fellowship and harmony. And this parallel is highlighted in the tagline that was seen in advertising and marketing for the film, which says, "Love who you want, it's good foreign policy." So in this way, I would say the trade deal is important to the ideology of the film, which comes out of the mood and mindset of the Democratic Party in the early 21st century. This party that also had come to embrace trade deals, not just as a useful policy, but also as an expression of the desire for a peaceful, prosperous, global future. And it's most important to note the language and ideals that have commonly been used to rationalize these trade agreements. So trade policy became a big issue first in the 1970s and 80s, and free trade and globalization, as we saw, aroused opposition. The common view about this issue among Republicans in the Reagan era was basically dismissive, and they argued that the economy is inevitably changing and those who cannot adapt will simply be left behind, right? It's sink or swim. Now, in areas that were rapidly losing jobs, like the upper Midwest, Republicans often told people to move, specifically to the Sun Belt, even more particularly to Texas, which was seen to represent the new economy. For instance, in the 1989 documentary Roger and Me, the filmmaker Michael Moore, who's from Flint, Michigan, went to Flint to talk to people about the fact that an auto company in that town was imminently going to close their plants and move operations to Mexico. And so he spoke with workers and citizens in the community, and among them, Michael Moore and his crew spoke to a group of about a dozen workers who had just had a sort of informal town hall meeting in a pizzeria with Ronald Reagan when Reagan visited Flint.
He suggested that maybe some of us could find better jobs elsewhere, like in Texas or in the southern states.
And one of them recalled that he advised them that when the plants shut down, they could simply move south, for instance, to Texas. But this worker said that she found this solution unworkable.
And that's when I spoke up, because I have a son, a home, and I can't just pull up stakes and take off.
Now, as we saw after 1992, Democrats under Clinton also embraced free trade. And they took a similar cavalier attitude. Although their rhetoric was softened somewhat and maybe more optimistic about a future transition to a service economy, they also argued that this changeover from manufacturing to something else was inevitable. And on balance, this would be good for everyone. Manufacturing may be lost, but people could then move into the new service economy of finance, tech, and media. And furthermore, democratic strategists and operatives argued that these industries, finance, tech, media, etc., should then be the new base of the Democratic Party. They ought to appeal to so-called wired workers or the creative class, etc. In other words, they should aim to win over affluent white-collar workers who previously might have been Republicans. And they argued this not just because that would bring in more votes. These white-collar workers are not that numerous. It's not that many votes there. But also the Democratic Party should appeal to them because they are better, smarter, have more money, and they represent the future in an abstract way. In other words, this was an ideological choice to try to win over educated white-collar workers. Now, as for blue-collar workers in the so-called Rust Belt, they, in the view of these Democratic strategists and even Democratic leaders, those blue-collar workers can just be taken for granted or even jettisoned. And this was sometimes stated more or less explicitly. So this new mentality was summed up and promoted in a book called The Emerging Democratic Majority, which was published in 2002 and written by Democratic strategists Judas and Tejera. And this book basically stated that demographic shifts would guarantee that the Democrats would rule in the 21st century. For instance, firstly, the growth in the number of Hispanics, which they believed would remain a, quote, rock-solid base of Democratic support, even as the population grew and diversified. Secondly, they argued that the Democratic Party would be buoyed by the growth in new post-industrial cities based around tech and finance, such as Seattle, Raleigh-Durham, Phoenix, and of course Silicon Valley. And they call these cities idiopolises, because, polis like city, and they don't produce manufactured goods. They don't produce anything tangible. They produce ideas. So they're idiopolises. And Judas and Tejera argue that these will supplant the old industrial cities as political and economic centers, and they will be democratic bastions. And finally, they argued that this whole new coalition could be held together by a progressive centrism that defends the legacies of the New Deal and the movements of the 60s for women's rights and environmentalism. So basically, the 2010s can be seen as the high watermark of optimism for this new democratic hegemony. There was even a kind of triumphalism, which held that Democrats were about to secure a ruling majority in the country based on winning over affluent, educated Republicans and banking on demographic change, which would inevitably work in their favor. Hence, the Democrats had no need to maintain their support among blue-collar workers. In 2016, during the Democratic National Convention, the Democratic Senate leader Chuck Schumer gave an interview on C-SPAN, which has since become kind of notorious, and I'm going to abuse it again as other people have. So in this interview in 2016, Schumer declared that he expected the Democrats would win the White House and the Senate.
You could end up with a situation where Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Missouri all have 2 Democratic senators.
And he based this conclusion on demographics.
The electorate is moving in a Democratic direction.
Namely that young people and Hispanics were going to turn out and vote for Democrats at record highs.
The Hispanic vote is going to be overwhelmingly Democratic, but the biggest change is the millennials, and they are much more Democratic than the electorate as a whole.
The interviewer then asks Schumer whether he's concerned that the party is slipping among the working class.
But does he play into that fear, not in Philadelphia or its suburbs, but out in Johnstown?
And Schumer says it doesn't matter if they lose those voters.
For every blue-collar Democrat we will lose in Western PA, we will pick up 2-3 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia.
They can simply be replaced.
And you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin.
Namely by affluent Republicans in the suburbs.
The voters who are figuring out what to do are not the blue-collar Democrats. They are college-educated Republican and in the suburbs.
So these comments can be seen as an encapsulation of Democratic thinking about class at this time. They were willing to lose working-class votes in exchange for those of the more affluent. And this change in class orientation goes hand in hand with a shift in region. In other words, a shift in the places where the Democrats imagined their base to be geographically. So the shift was not only from cities to suburbs, like Schumer alludes to in this interview, but also a shift in which kinds of cities they focused on. Basically, they followed the advice of Judas and Tejera in their book, The Emerging Democratic Majority, and they concentrated on so-called swing districts, mainly around growing affluent cities. And on the wider continental scale, there was a shift from north to south, specifically from the upper Midwest industrial areas to growing Sun Belt states with big service industries and Hispanic populations, such as Georgia, Virginia, and Arizona. And this could be seen to culminate when the idea was briefly put forward and discussed in the mid-2010s that the party could solve its electoral problems for the foreseeable future in one fell swoop by winning the grand prize of Texas. So Texas, of course, has a large number of electoral votes. It can outweigh about 2 to 3 normal-sized swing states. But it also has great symbolic value. As we saw, it's the buckle of the Sun Belt with a large Hispanic community, and it was dotted with growing, prosperous cities and suburbs, included among them Austin, which is one of the 10 wealthiest cities in the United States, with many universities and tech companies like Dell and Tesla. So winning Texas at the presidential level would represent a kind of final total victory for the imagined new Democratic majority and for the vision of America that it was taken to represent. Now, you know probably that this has failed to materialize, right? Texas has not moved into the Democratic column at the presidential level, nor even on the Senate level, although it's come a bit closer. And this failure is in part because younger and Hispanic voters did not vote nearly as strongly Democratic as pundits and party operatives had assumed. It turns out demography is not destiny. Things are more complicated than that. Nonetheless, we can see in the film that Alex's idea actually reflects common thinking among Democrats in these heady days of the 2010s. And Red, White, and Royal Blue can be seen as an alternate history in which the dream of the emerging Democratic majority actually does come true, and in which the gambit for the Sun Belt succeeds. So hence the enormous symbolism of the final election result, where the loss of the Midwest, even including Minnesota, a state that's voted reliably Democratic for decades, the loss of the Midwest, but the victory in Texas takes on a sort of apocalyptic or millenarian resonance. It imagines the opening of a new era, more or less the new dispensation governed by this long prophesied Democratic majority. And in some, the film imagines the realization of this early 21st century Democratic Party dream of jettisoning the old America in favor of the new. Hence the final, I would say the final meaning of that line, "We won." This America beat that one. So that line signifies a personal victory, an electoral victory for the Claremont administration, and a broader political victory for this imagined new American majority. Now, what we don't know with respect to this final line is who exactly is this we? Who could it be in reality? Right? Who actually makes up this coalition, and why and how did they come together? What shared interests or aspirations created the alliances that built this winning coalition? This is left out of the story. And finally, I'd like to just drive this home by what I think might be a helpful contrast with another great film on politics and queer liberation. And that is the movie Pride, which was made in 2014 in Great Britain. This movie takes place 30 years before it was made. Specifically, it takes place during the massive 1984 miners' strike that shut down the coal mines across the UK. And the movie follows a group of young gays and lesbians in London who band together to raise money and show solidarity for the striking miners. And the group is organized by a young radical named Mark Ashton, who sees images on the news of police beating striking miners and picketers, and these remind him of the harassment and brutality that police in London visited upon gay men.
Now, these mining communities are being bullied just like we are. Bullied by the police, bullied by the tabloids, bullied by the government.
So Mark Ashton argues that lesbians and gays in London should be allies to the miners.
Do any of them need a hug? No, what they need is cash. And they need it urgently.
Yeah, because the miners have always come to our aid, haven't they?
And some of his gay friends and associates in London reject this mission and say things like, those people don't support us, or even those are the kind of people that beat me up in school. But Ashton and his allies press ahead and they create LGSM, Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners. And since the strike was technically illegal, they cannot donate to the National Union of Mine Workers, the UK-wide umbrella organization that undertook this strike. Instead, they have to pair up with a specific local mining community and support their strike committee directly. So they make an arrangement with the strike committee in the Dulles Valley, a rural area in South Wales. And members of LGSM travel there to the Dulles Valley and visit many times. They stay in people's homes. They donate money and eventually a van, which the miners can use for transport to and from the picket lines and which is emblazoned with LGSM. So as depicted in the movie, despite some homophobia, LGSM is widely embraced in Dulles Valley. And from what I've read, the film even plays up the homophobia, even beyond what really happened. LGSM members say that they really never saw it. The organization is only openly attacked in the British tabloid press. That perennial villain. The press which runs lurid mocking headlines like Pits and Perverts. And hence LGSM organized a party fundraiser in London called Pits and Perverts. Now, as depicted in the film, the two groups, the miners in South Wales and the lesbian and gay activists in London, these two groups form a friendship and a lasting political bond.
Two hands. That's what the Labour movement means. Should mean. You support me, I support you, whoever you are, wherever you come from, shoulder to shoulder, hand to hand.
The following summer, in 1985, NUM mine workers' bands from around Britain led the Gay Pride March in London. And in following years, one woman who was on the local committee in Dulles Valley, named Sian James, became a political organizer in South Wales and then was elected to Parliament. And under her influence as an MP, the Labour Party adopted the first ever platform planks supporting gay rights. So the movie Pride has certain crucial things in it that are not seen in Red, White, and Royal Blue. Among them, a sense of commonality among political allies, which creates solidarity, and then in turn a shared sense of dignity, hence the name, Pride. Also, class is explicitly part of the story, not just as a buzzword or a personal background, but rather as a set of relationships rooted in shared struggles. Now, I am not saying here that therefore Pride is a better movie. I wouldn't say that. Nor am I saying that every gay movie or every political movie has to be like Pride. Pride is a different kind of movie, also in that it's based on true events, not fiction. But the fact that Red, White, and Royal Blue is fiction means that it also has a great degree of freedom. Freedom to tell the story in the way that the filmmakers want. And it cannot include everything, it has to make choices. But those choices about what to include and what to leave out reflect a certain ideological perspective. So the contrast with Pride is revealing, in that in Pride, politics appears as an arena in which citizens and groups ally together to engage in common struggles, and in which the most dramatic events are driven by ordinary people who enter into this arena. Whereas in Red, White, and Royal Blue, politics appears as a stage or a theater in which elite personalities perform for the public and shape events through symbolic acts. Hence the characters' constant anxiety about their public appearances. So in Red, White, and Royal Blue, the public is not the active driver of events, but more a passive audience that responds. So in sum, it may seem that I have been very harsh here in my critique of this movie. But my goal here is not to say it's not a great movie. I think it is great. The goal here is to try to uncover the ideological mindset that shapes and limits the movie and how it portrays politics. I think this is important and worthwhile because the political ideology that shapes this film is one that so often goes unexamined when it should be. Or when it is examined, it's often just through a crude or dismissive satire and not with careful analysis. A main problem here is that this ideology imagines politics as a performative arena in which persona, personality, and symbolism overshadow policy and material interests. It's a view of politics that is superficial and implicitly elitist, envisioning the force of change coming from the top down. And so in this way, it distracts from or devalues the work of building alliances and movements from the bottom up. In this way, I would say it serves to protect the status quo. It discourages actual revisioning of politics from the public at large. And one could ask why there is this huge difference between Red, White, and Royal Blue and Pride. And several reasons come to mind. Pride is British, whereas Red, White, and Royal Blue is American. That may be part of it. Pride is based on a true story, and so has a more realistic understanding of politics. Another crucial difference, finally, is who made the film. So this is a context that we cannot ignore. Pride was produced by a variety of different outfits, such as BBC, BFI, and Pathé. So it includes several nonprofits, each of which probably contributed some portion of the budget till it added up to enough to make this film. By contrast, Red, White, and Royal Blue is made by Amazon Studios. So that is a subsidiary of a very large for-profit corporation, which is owned in turn by Jeff Bezos, one of the richest men in the world. And more specifically, Bezos and Amazon have been engaged in a long-running struggle with labor organizers who want to unionize the Amazon workforce, and who won their first beachhead when the workers at the distribution warehouse on Staten Island voted to unionize in 2022. So I would posit that this fact can help to account for why this film discusses workers, manufacturing, and trade, yet never mentions the word labor, or which repeatedly makes reference to the working class as a social background, but never once uses the word union. This film presents, I would say, a story that might challenge the status quo with regard to gender and sexuality, but not with regard to class or worker power. In other words, not in any way that might hit the owners of Amazon in the pocketbook. Now, different people might react in different ways to my pointing out these facts, and I do not mean to say that Jeff Bezos went into the studio in England where they were filming this movie and told the filmmakers, you're allowed to talk about trade deals, but not about unions, etc. Ideological influence rarely ever works in such a crude or blunt way. And even if the corporate higher-ups from Amazon did try to interfere with the content of this film, I don't think that Matthew Lopez or Casey McQuiston would have stood for it. I think all indications are that they were very insistent on the script of the movie following their visions down to the last detail. But nonetheless, the fact is, ownership of a media outlet does shape what that outlet presents to the public by choosing what sort of stories and people to emphasize, and who and what to pass over in silence. Now, for instance, back in 2019, Senator Bernie Sanders, when he was starting his second presidential race, he complained that Amazon paid no taxes in that year. And he then commented, quote, "And then I wonder why the Washington Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, doesn't write particularly good articles about me. I don't know why." End quote. So Sanders was clearly insinuating that the Post writes unfavorably about him because he is a critic of the paper's owner, Jeff Bezos. Now, the editor of the Washington Post struck back by saying that Bezos allowed the paper full independence, those are his words, and he called Sanders' insinuation a conspiracy theory. Other media outlets also piled on as well, such as CBS, which ran a headline saying, quote, "Bernie Sanders echoes Trump in Washington Post feud." Now, some observers, such as myself, would argue that even if the owner of an outlet does respect the editorial independence of the newsroom or the film studio or what have you, Nonetheless, they do have the power to make ultimate decisions, such as who will be the editor or how the business expands or contracts. Hence, they have control over whose job might be on the chopping block. And in this way, media workers would have to be superhuman, not to take into account and be influenced by the interests of their own employers. And in the case of the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos, even the formal pretense of editorial independence was eventually dropped in 2024 when Jeff Bezos did intervene directly to nix the paper's plan to endorse a presidential candidate. So whatever the merits of that plan, which I won't dispute one way or another, this incident proves that the full independence of the paper was in fact just a conditional arrangement which Bezos was willing to discard when it suited his agenda. So what does all of this mean then with regard to Red, White, and Royal Blue? It does not mean that the film was conceived or executed as some sort of piece of propaganda for Jeff Bezos. Rather, it is an adaptation of a novel, and according to many fans, it's a good adaptation of a tremendously popular book. Nor is there any sign that the film was censored. Indeed, the very conspicuous lack of any mention of labor or unions is also consistent with the book. As far as I can see, the word labor does not appear once in the novel of Red, White, and Royal Blue, and the word union appears only as part of the phrase Union Jack. So rather, what I think is this: Amazon Studios chose to produce a film based on a story that is highly popular, inventive, and rich, and that also happened not to threaten the interests of the studio that made it, nor of the multi-billionaire who owns it. And this again does not mean it's a bad film. It means that it's a film that has an ideology very deeply embedded in it, and that ideology serves to limit what we see and hear. And this makes it, in a sense, safe for Amazon. So we should be aware that if there are other stories out there, including good love stories, good queer love stories, or good political love stories, that come from a different perspective, and particularly that deal with class and material issues, then Amazon is probably not a studio that will make them into movies. And it may be much harder for those kinds of films to be produced with the sort of budget that Red, White, and Royal Blue had, or to be produced at all. So ultimately, I would say we should not enjoy this film any less for what it has to offer, but we should be aware of its limitations, its strengths and weaknesses, so as to appreciate that much more what is yet to be done, and how much territory is yet to be explored, and what sort of stories we should still hope to be told. So thank you to everyone who's watched and shared and commented on this series, and thank you to the patrons of Historiansplaining who made it possible to begin this series in the first place.